golden ages and how to create them, because this is my next book. So this is a kind of a preview. This is not a book you'll find out there. It'll be published in May. So, and this is actually the first time I'm really talking about it in public. So you still have the chance to ruin my confidence in my whole hypothesis about world history here. It's about the rise of civilizations, but also the fall of civilizations. And in a way, I think it's perfect timing to be talking about the end of world orders. We'll see where we'll get there tonight. This is what the book looks like, Peak Human. One guy at my publisher said that it sounds a little bit like an exercise book. It sounds like physical fitness and how you get into shape. And then another guy at the publisher said, that'll help us to sell copies of this book if people think it's about physical fitness. But in a way, it is about fitness. It is about how to stay in shape, but not as individuals, but as a culture for civilizations. How do we do that? How can we avoid to get out of shape? Why am I obsessed with this topic? Why have I been waiting so long to think and to read and do research about this? It's because of this. I don't know if you recognize the place, but this feeling might be familiar to some of you who've been traveling around the world, traveling around Europe, looking at some of the extraordinary places of magnificent achievements in history. I did so in Athens, in Greece, and I looked at some of those important places, the Democratic Assembly, and also Aristotle's Lyceum. This is where Aristotle taught his pupils, walked around and talked about logic and the world. And I must say, when I got there, I got so depressed. It wasn't really what I expected, but I was kind of saddened. These used to be places of bustling creativity, some of the most important places in history. But now suddenly it's kind of silent. It's over. What was left is sort of kind of in those places rubble, garbage, actually some dog waste and silence, except the odd passerby who asked me for a cigarette, clearly intoxicated guy. And of course, there are places of spectacular beauty in Athens as well. You go to the Acropolis and you look at the Parthenon, it's amazing. And yet it's not what it used to be, right? It's mostly lots of rocks and piled together and then patched together and then with plaques telling us that this used to be the center of the world. It's over when you get there. And that's so incredibly depressing. This must have been what Shelley, the poet, thought about when he wrote Ozymandias, when he's writing about this traveler walking in the desert and then coming across this crumbled monument to Ozymandias, King of Kings. And it says, "Look on my works, you mighty, and despair." But the traveler looks around. Nothing besides remains. The lone and level sands stretch far away. And since then, and I'm still doing this, traveling to all these places, I've never been able to stop thinking about not just golden ages, but also how transient they are. That how could they appear so quickly, but also decline so thoroughly that they left little trace. It forced me to consider whether travelers in the future will walk to our cityscapes, our old buildings, monuments, plazas, hotels, and think about why our civilization lost its way and why it all became so sluggish, stationary, and silent. The sad thing is that golden ages become golden in retrospect. The future generations, they think about it, wow, they really had something impressive going here. But at their peak, they were extraordinary. You might be familiar with this chart, the most important chart in the world. This is what economic historians think about global GDP per capita over the past 2,000 years. And basically nothing much happens until in the past 200 years, everything happens all at once. And in the richest countries, we increased the average living standards by some 3,000%. So we should be grateful for living in this part of time. Of course, this is before the trade war, so it might come down a little bit, but not all the way down, I hope. But what's interesting to me is that it looks like almost nothing happens here. But obviously, people were innovative and entrepreneurial, and they were looking for a better tomorrow even back then. And they accomplished amazing things. The future tried to happen lots of times in the past as well, but only in certain areas, and it didn't really affect the average living standards on the planet. That tells you about our possibilities, that people have always tried to achieve things. And it helps us to understand what made it happen, but also why they can be fleeting moments. That's why I talk and write about golden ages. As Joel Moker, the economic historian, has put it, a society that has ceased to concern itself with the progress of the past will soon lose belief in its capacity to progress in the future. So that's why I want to talk about this tonight. So let's start by trying to define what is a golden age? What are we talking about? What are we thinking of in history when we say that something was a remarkable civilization? To me, it's a period, it's not necessarily lots of marble, but that could be part of it, but it's a period with a large number of changes and innovations that revolutionize many fields and sectors and aspects of life at the same time, in a short period of time. It is associated with a culture of possibility, of optimism, which encourage people to explore new knowledge, experiment with new methods and technologies, and exchange the result with others. Its characteristics are cultural creativity, scientific discoveries, technological achievements, and economic growth that stand out, at least compared to what had come before, and often what came after, and definitely compared to other contemporary cultures. And the result is a high average living standard, which is usually the envy of others, but often of future generations as well. Relatively speaking, let me point that out instantly, relative to contemporary cultures, because it wasn't all great for everybody, not even in these great civilizations that I will talking about. Most people lived still in abject poverty, in oppression. All of these cultures had some form of slavery. Women had almost no rights in most of these societies. Mary Beard, a scholar of the Roman Empire, points out that when she talks about Rome, and people are sort of think of this as a remarkable period in human history, she notices that they all think that they would have been emperors back in Rome, or at least senators. And that's a few hundred people. Most likely you would have been one of the millions subsistence farmers or slaves in that culture. But this did not set these cultures apart from other contemporary cultures. They all had slavery, oppression. Life was mostly nasty, brutish, and short in most places. And people have had very few freedoms. What set the golden ages apart was that relative to those neighbors, they had more freedom, they had more opportunity, they had more innovation, they had more growth. And that's why I think it's fitting to think about, why did that happen? How did they accomplish this? So let me just briefly then walk you through the 7 civilizations that I've been looking particularly at in this history, in this story. And obviously we start with ancient Athens. Most things start in Greece, especially in Athens. This small city-state 2,500 years ago that gave us the idea of democracy, the science of history, gave us rhetoric, comedy and tragedy, philosophy, and I would argue the very idea of intellectual innovation. All previous cultures had had some element of some people coming up with new ideas, but they had to pretend that they were very old ideas indeed. I got this from my forefathers. I got this from God. I got this from something that we have been doing all along. In ancient Athens, for the first time, we see people who argue that their insights are novel and that they contribute something that no one has thought of before. And that sets it apart. And we can see this in Aristotle's subtweet of Plato when he points out that, yes, our friends and teachers are dear to us, and so is truth. But while both are dear, piety requires us to honor truth above our friends. I would argue that this is the start of intellectual innovation in human history in a more lasting way. So it's fitting to start there. But then we move on to Athens' inheritor, Rome. Rome, the capture, becoming captive herself, according to the old poem, by Greek ideas, by Greek philosophy. The Republic and the Empire that men apparently think of every day, according to a very popular meme. I think we should think about it every day because we got so much from Rome. We got influenced our legal system, our urban grids, our architectural styles, concrete, the word and idea of a republic and a senate meeting in the capital. It's all Roman. Our Latin alphabet, of course, and the calendar. And apparently the meme is correct. A US study showed that some 13% of American men think about Rome every day, which is interesting. The same study showed, by the way, that 49% of US adults say that the Roman Empire, not even the Republic, but that the Roman Empire had a positive impact on the world, compared to only 15% negative, which gives it a better confidence and trust indicator than all leading American politicians right now. The Roman Empire, with gladiators and slaves and warfare, would win in a landslide in any American election right now, which also tells us something, at least about American politics. The inheritor of Rome was not the Byzantine Empire, because in Byzantium, which is the eastern part of Rome, was a part of Rome where they rapidly became more fundamentalist Christians, forgot all about heathen philosophy. That which was not forgotten was burnt, and the dissidents and heretics were thrown out, expelled, or killed, and turned elsewhere. And they often turned to the Abbasid Caliphate, with its capital here in Baghdad, a place where the caliphs said that we are the inheritors of Greece and of Rome, whereas Byzantium, Constantinople, they've lost the plot completely and they've become intolerant and fundamentalists and want to destroy everything. The Abbasid Caliphate was a vast free trade empire built on the same kind of law, from the Atlantic coast almost all the way to Afghanistan, over Mesopotamia, Persia, and the Arab world. This, by the way, is the capital, Baghdad, called the crossroads of the universe. And the architectural style is interesting. It was an attempt to emulate a perfect circle in honor of the geometric teachings of Euclid, whom the Caliph Mansour admired. And at a time when Paris and London, these metropolises, had some 10,000 inhabitants, Baghdad had at least 500,000 inhabitants. Bookstores and businesses and bazaars and hospitals all over the place in the 8th and 9th century. Built its scientific and technological advances on a translation movement where they tried to translate all the philosophy, all the science that they could lay their hands on from all over the world. And thereby they preserved much of the Greek heritage and created a universal science. They didn't think that there was one Arab science and one Christian science, but everything that tells us about the facts of the world and its regularities can be used to accumulate more knowledge and build more science. And we don't have to go further than the word A to see the debt, the gratitude we have to this Arab Persian civilization. Arabic numerals from India, algebra, algorithm, arithmetic, average, all Arab words during the golden age of Arab science. The Caliph himself, he justified many of these ideas and the translation movement with a dream that he had, a dream of an old man talking to him, sitting by his bed and talking to him about when you blind your eyes to the world, to the facts, wherever they come from, you blind yourself to the truth and to the world, and you will reject, you will deny yourself knowledge and capacity. And that was his dream of Aristotle. The Caliph thought that Aristotle had come to him in a vision, telling him that he should search for facts and truth alone. And that built much of that golden age. It ended over there as well, eventually. So we now have to go to the other side of the world, to China. To China under the Song dynasty in the 10th to 13th century. You know, Karl Marx, that writer of other manifestos, he once claimed, interestingly, that the magnetic compass, the printing press, and gunpowder, those are the three inventions that unleashed the European bourgeoisie and built modern capitalism in the 17th, 18th century. But of course, the Chinese had that 1,000 years ago. James Needham, who devoted his life to studying the history of technology in China, writes, "Whenever one follows up any specific piece of scientific or technological history in Chinese literature, it is always at the Song dynasty that one finds the major focal point. Not just those inventions and paper money that built a commercial economy. It goes for hydraulic engineering, shipbuilding, bridge building, architecture, chemical science, textile machines, iron and steel production. Based on a new system the Song dynasty had built, which had more of rule of law, which reduced the arbitrary powers of the local officials and even of the emperor, of strong property rights for the farmers so that they benefited from new inventions, new crops, new irrigation systems, and a commercial economy with paper currency and strong trade. They came close to unleashing modern science and initiating an industrial revolution some 700 years ago. In the 11th century, China produced more iron than all European countries in 1700. And they had textile machines that ran on water power and pedals, muscle power, and things like that. Some technological and technology historians think that had they just pursued that a bit further, if they had had that freedom, they would have had an industrial revolution before it was even a glint in European eyes. But it didn't last, so we are going back to Europe again, this time the Italian Renaissance in the 14th and 15th century. The Italian trading cities, here it's Florence, that were inspired by stories from Marco Polo about how incredibly wealthy and technologically advanced that the Chinese were, and learned from the Arabs and from the capitalist economy that they had built on the Mediterranean. The Pope tried to stop them from trading with Muslims, but as the Italians said in a slogan that really should be turned into a T-shirt in our day and age, trade should be free and unhindered, even into the gates of hell. Now, those are real free traders, right? And they also rediscovered Greek ideals, Greek philosophy and art and Roman law, which began to implement more of rule of law in those city-states, and merchant guilds that implemented some checks and balances on the rulers, thereby creating new republics. It's restored a culture of innovation and examination after the Dark Ages and pioneered organized big enterprises and financial capitalism. And of course, we get it from the Italians, words like bank, bankrupt, karat, career, cartel, cash, credit, mercantile, management, and net. And they were interested in consumption, conspicuous consumption. That was what art was all about. In cities that had more social mobility, where it didn't matter as much where you came from, which family, you had to prove your ability and your status in a new way. And people did so, and families did so, and banks did so by commissioning great pieces of art and sculptures and paintings. And that was a profession. It was a part of the economy. They all often had businesses that and very collaborative systems of organizing this, and fierce competition between those artists. Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, who really didn't like one another. Michelangelo complained that Leonardo was a procrastinator. He never really finished any of his jobs. And Leonardo replied that, all those muscular statues and David and stuff like that, and the things you do for the Pope with muscular guys, it looks more like sacks of walnuts to me than real muscles. And I think some of that competition was great. It got them both to work harder and try to achieve something more. And it's still some of the greatest masterpieces that the world has ever seen. But that European spark faced some trouble during the religious wars, the Counter-Reformation. Books were banned, and the Pope ordered lesser-known painters to start painting fig leaves on all Michelangelo's paintings. So the European spirit moved northwest to the Dutch Republic. And this might be my favorite story in all of human history. Because, it's crazy. If I had pitched this to Netflix as a sort of a 2-3 season series about rebels, stubborn merchants and eccentric Calvinists who don't even have land on which to stand. They have to dig it out and steal it from the ocean. They would have said that this is just too unrealistic. No one will believe this because they're in the sodden northwestern periphery of Europe, fought for their lives for 80 years against the greatest empire on earth in the 16th and early 17th century, for 80 years against Spain. The Habsburg Spain and the Holy Roman Empire run by the Habsburg family at that time as well, who wanted to control the Netherlands. They fought against them for 80 years, and these sort of merchants over there who had nothing. They had no standing army. They had no navy. They didn't have an established religion. They didn't have strong traditions. They didn't have strong universities. But therefore, they had to get it. Therefore, they had to be innovative. And therefore, they exchanged and traded with the rest of the world. And English observers pointed out that it's crazy because they don't produce anything in the Dutch Republic, but they have everything. What's up with that? In the end, at the end of these 80 years, the Spanish Empire was depleted and impoverished, having declared state bankruptcy 5 times. Whereas this band of rebels, on the other hand, who had nothing, they became the world's richest people, built the first modern capitalist economy, a world empire, and through an unprecedented open intellectual climate, they also developed an extraordinary efflorescence with golden age painters like Rembrandt and Vermeer that ended up in paintings in the homes of the middle classes. Merchants and financiers created the wealth, and then the printing houses, scientists, and philosophers created the Enlightenment, because this is where it started. Before it made it to Paris and to London and to Scotland, there was a reason why Descartes, Spinoza, John Locke, they all ended up in the Dutch Republic, because they were open to those ideas that would have at least made them imprison them or even put them on the stakes. So I just think it would be too unbelievable to pitch this as a series for Netflix, because it's too astonishing. Somebody else might. And then those ideas get a longer lease of life in what I call the Anglosphere, in Britain and in the United States. Because in 1688, the Dutch Republic and the Dutch stadtholder Willem of Orange invades England to avoid being surrounded by a hostile, despotic England and France at the same time. They are just doing a Hail Mary and thinking that the only thing we can do is to try to invade England, a bigger, safer country with more resources, and get it by invitation from the Whig forces in Parliament, who were also afraid of the Stuart monarchs. So the Dutch invade England, soon to become Great Britain after the union with Scotland, and the invasion is rapidly rebranded a glorious revolution, and the English are very proud of it later on. What's even more glorious is that when these ideas are transplanted into this bigger body, with more distance to Spain and France and hostile invaders, they also inherited rule of law, ideas about private property, of free markets, of the Enlightenment, and that eventually ushered in the most important revolution in history, the industrial one, the one that made it possible for us to stay alive and to go forth and procreate. The first revolution that has never ended, and then reinforced and accelerated when the British did the best thing that they've ever done, lost its American colonies, because then those ideas were transplanted into an even larger body, even more safer, with two world oceans on either side. Turned it into a reservoir of liberty that kept pushing the technological and economic frontier and the intellectual frontier for the rest of the world, and came back to Europe and saved us from committing suicide again and again under the 20th century. And after the Second World War, built an open world order based on trade, based on the freedom of movement for capital and ideas, that helped other countries to do the same journey. And now, for the first time, we see that the golden eras aren't isolated anymore. Suddenly we have that hockey stick chart that we saw in the beginning, where more and more countries get the same kinds of freedom and the same kind of innovation. That's why we moved in 200 years from a world where 90% of the world population lived in extreme poverty to around 9% today. A world in which the average life expectancy was 30 years, and now it's above 70 years. I'm especially grateful at my age for this development, and that's the one important thing you learn from history: gratitude. We stand on the shoulders of innovators, of entrepreneurs, of adventurers who made this progress possible. We owe them recognition, and we owe ourselves to emulate them. And that's the question. How do we do that? If we're interested in golden ages, if we want this to last and hopefully to deepen, what do we do? Well, the first thing to remember is that look at these diverse groups in strange places. Heathens, Muslims, Confucians, Catholics, Calvinists, Anglicans, atheists. It's not who they are or where they are. The place that was a backwater in one era is suddenly top of the world in the next era. It's not their ethnicity, it's not their traditions. The common denominator is that they didn't turn their background and their ideas into one orthodoxy that couldn't be challenged, this far, no further, and now we block all further innovation. The fact was that they came up with new ideas and started to challenge what they were already doing. So first of all, to create a golden age, you need lots of people. You need lots of people because that helps you to specialize, to the greater the chance that someone stumbles onto a good new idea, more people to learn from and more people to collaborate and exchange with. So it takes a certain population density. Often it happens in urban areas where people meet from different backgrounds. But then it takes three more things. It takes, first of all, openness. Because what you do is that you imitate and you innovate. First, you often imitate. You see what's possible somewhere else, and that inspires you to do something else. This is ancient Greece. Why was it special? Because they had 1,000 different polities where they did with different constitutions, different religions, different mythologies, different ways of killing each other because they were brutal, like they were not good guys all the time, right? But it helped them to see that something else can be possible. It helped them to challenge previous ideas. In Mesopotamia or Egypt, where your ruler is a god or very closely connected to one, it's difficult to challenge things, right? But if you are surrounded by 1,000 other polities where there are other rulers, other ideas, it helps you to examine, scrutinize, criticize, and innovate. When Aristotle wrote about the good constitution, he looked at some 159 different constitutions and examined them before he ended up with his own proposal. And they were all traders. They had to trade. It's a rocky place it's difficult to get enough food in every single place. So especially Athens had to go out there and trade all the time. And then they saw even more interesting things in other places. Pericles, the ruler of Athens, well, not the ruler, but one of the generals, famously said that our city is open to the world. And that's what set it apart. And so were the Italian Renaissance cities, the Dutch, the British, the Americans. Rome and the Roman Republic and the Empire was different. Unlike all the other civilizations, they were not seafarers to begin with. They were not traders to begin with. But they had another form of openness, which was interesting. They were cruel conquerors, but they also had the wisdom to realize that they should keep many of the institutions and people, even their hierarchies and their technologies and their belief systems intact, rather than being sort of the Borg of Star Trek fame who just assimilate everything and turn everybody into the same thing. They learned from new ideas and let them keep their ideas and their technologies and emulated what worked best in different places. They were, as Montesquieu, the Enlightenment writer, put it, the Romans became conquerors of the whole world because they were the quickest at abandoning their own traditions the moment they found something else that was better elsewhere. And this was not because they were sort of open-minded, generous liberals of some sort. Tolerance was a weapon. Tolerance was a way of beating other people up and stealing their stuff. So again, not decent people in every way, but we can learn something from what made them so strong. Strategic tolerance was a weapon, literally. They got all their stuff from others. They got their armor from the Gallic tribes, their organization of their legions from the Etruscans. They got their Spanish swords from the Spanish. They got their spears from the Samnites and so on and so on. When they decided to build a navy, they took a Carthaginian shipwreck and just imitated it all over. They even began to experiment with war elephants when Hannibal had tried to conquer them by taking the elephants over the Alps. So they were smart enough to understand that if we just crush everybody else, we will lose their brains, their talents, their hard work. We're going to have to learn from it. And then they also became traders eventually. So openness comes in different forms, and this is the Abbasid Baghdad, where their openness was based on both of these things, conquering and imitating and trading, but also their houses of wisdom, where they invited scholars and scientists from all over the world, whatever religion and background, and just asked them of their ideas and translated their books to learn from them and to get further than anybody else. And then another source for many of these, Rome, the Dutch Republic, America, is to constantly rejuvenate themselves by immigration, by being open to talent, being open to new ideas and new people from elsewhere. So that's the first thing. You have to be open to something else so that you get inspired, you have the ingredients with which to work. But then you also need freedom to start preparing exotic and unprecedented dishes based on these ingredients. Joel Moker, again, the economic historian, he put it like this: every act of innovation is an act of rebellion against conventional wisdom and vested interests. So we need freedom of speech, we need rule of law to limit the arbitrary powers of the rulers, and we need free markets and free trade. Here with Sinbad, who, if you've read the original stories, is a capitalist out on trips to make money, not war, all the time. That's the freedom that we need to then experiment with these ingredients and come up with new novel ideas, technologies, and with the goods and services we all like. But then you need something more. It's not enough with openness and liberty. You need a culture of hope, a culture of optimism, the belief that it's possible to understand, to learn, and to achieve. So all of these cultures had philosophies. Often they were explicit and verbalized. Sometimes they were just know-how. They had worldly philosophies, from Aristotle to Cicero in Rome, the Neo-Confucians in China to Enlightenment. They all shared some form of the idea that reality has a permanent existence and that it is possible to discover patterns in it, natural laws, and therefore that there is a role for scientists and for artists to explore this world, to learn something from it, and even to get engineers and entrepreneurs to manipulate this world to create new solutions to all our problems. And when they did so, they inspired others. Because innovation is hard, and the result is never guaranteed. Most experiments fail. So it takes hope, it takes role models, it takes heroes that makes us believe that it might work out. It's worth trying. Others to be inspired with, to learn from, to compete with. And if you've read Ayn Rand's novel, The Fountainhead, you might remember how the sight of one man's achievement provides a young boy with the courage to face a lifetime. That's why we get these clusters of lots of philosophers suddenly in ancient Athens, lots of artists in Florence, classical music in Vienna, computer people in Silicon Valley. And that comes from this culture where you constantly mingle with, collaborate with, and learn from and compete with others. And let me just give you one example of what we need from Giotto, the great Florentine artist in the 13th century. He was a great pioneer in modern art, because look at his characters with depth, solidity, and motion. The use of colors convey perspective and distance. It's pretty amazing. And then everybody wanted to paint like that. Why did it happen then? We always knew that people had some depth and solidity, right? That there's distance. You could have painted that a long time ago. But no, this is what the Byzantine artists did just 50 years before that, when they painted the exact same thing, Judas' betrayal of Jesus. Byzantine artists, it's just not the same. But Byzantine artists weren't bad. They were just constrained and they were controlled because the church had come up with a compromise. Some people thought that it was never allowed to paint people, and much less Jesus. We have to burn all the paintings. But some said, okay, we can paint some things, but only if they portray exactly what happened, Jesus' stories just like they were, and then just the stuff as it was described. No variation, no perspective or scale, because that was not the point. You're telling a story. You're not painting a picture. So Mary is always bigger than Joseph because she's more important to the story. Jesus is always bigger than his disciples because he is the center of attention. They could have painted in another way, but nobody did for hundreds and hundreds of years, until Giotto suddenly just decided, what the heck, I'll do it anyway. He decided to rebel and change all that, and everyone followed. But someone has to be first. And that takes acts of rebellion. Let me just give you one other example, the flying shuttle. The flying shuttle was a great way of speeding up weaving during the Industrial Revolution, and then later on automated. It made it much more productive. And this always this is a big discussion among technology historians, because the flying shuttle seems so incredibly simple. It only took some string and two wooden boxes on either side to catch the shuttle. That's it. You don't need any specialized knowledge. You don't need any complex parts to do it. You should have been able to just make it happen without any education, without any specific skills, through trial and error. But for 5,000 years, nobody did. But it happened suddenly during the Industrial Revolution. Why? Because it was a golden age where people experimented, where there was a culture of optimism and hope. People saw that, look, we can improve everything. We can try new things. It might work out. It might even make you rich. And that's how progress happens and becomes self-generating. Because when you do, there's proof of concept, and that unleashes the continuously emergent novelty of golden ages. And that's why a general sense of pessimism is the worst thing there is, because it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we think that it's hopeless, we will despair, we will give up, we won't work, we won't try, and then we will end up in that place. So that's the golden ages. That's the great, wonderful story. Let me just use 2 minutes of my time to talk about this. Why does it decline and fall so often? Why do we end up here? And that's a very complex question, and I'd be happy to talk about this during the Q&A as well. But to me, if every act of innovation is rebellion against this perceived wisdom and vested interests, the problem is that perceived wisdom and vested interests, they often regain their footing and begin to fight back against innovation. They are often made up of political, economic, religious elites who have built their power on a certain system of ideas and of production. And they are afraid of that innovation. And they would be only too happy to strangle it through regulations, through censorship, through, and the picture I chose was the Galileo in front of the Inquisition. But it comes in many different forms. Every one of these civilizations had a, what I call a death to Socrates moment, when they suddenly began to lose faith in intellectual openness and began to reimpose orthodoxies. And often it happened in times of crisis, when perceived crisis, worry about the world, in times of great pandemics or war or economic disasters. People began to think that we might have to return to something more original and stable, rather than this ongoing innovation that keeps on happening. Because innovation and openness doesn't guarantee anything. But there will always be a strong man promising you and guaranteeing you everything. And when you panic, that's often where people go in these stories. In ancient Rome, by the end of it, when pagans for the first time for real started persecuting Christians, and then Christians took control and persecuted pagans. In the Abbasid Caliphate, they began to set up state-run schools, creating a state-religion alliance for the first time in its history, and strangled creativity. In China, when the Ming Dynasty took over, they didn't just burn the boats and ban international trade. They even forced people to wear the same kind of clothes that Chinese did 500 years ago to make China great again. You had to sort of return to some sort of ancient past. That was their idea. During the Counter-Reformation, burning of books, burning of heretics. Even in the Dutch Republic, in times of trouble. In 1672, when the French invaded, they panicked, and reaction was so powerful that they began to impose new Calvinist orthodoxies in many cities. They purged the universities of Enlightenment thinkers and even killed Johan de Witt, lynched him in the street, the great statesman who had led much of the Dutch wonder. People panic when there's this sense of crisis and they lose cultural self-confidence. The problem, of course, is that they then deny themselves the tools they need to deal with these crises, because they deny themselves that intellectual creativity and that technological innovation. So, in combination with more centralized states, we often saw how this innovation peters out in most civilizations. In other words, we're not in clashes of civilizations. We have a clash within every civilization between those who want rationality, openness, and progress, and those who want to impose orthodoxies on to others. The good news from this history reading is that it's possible in every culture. The bad news is it's not guaranteed in any. And then obviously the question is, where does this leave us? Because we've had 200 years, 200 good years, 200 best years in human history, actually. That's a long time for a golden age. And all the devils are here. All the backlashes, I think, against all the golden age conditions are there as well. A sense of fear and despair, a backlash against trade and against capitalism, against immigration, increasingly stifling regulation, colossal debts, and this kind of nostalgic revolt that comes both from the woke left and the nationalist Trumpian right, who both think that the end goal should be some sort of pure situation where we reject all the dissidents, everything that's not pure, everything that's not sameness and a part of the collective, some sort of homogeneous utopia. And that's why I think the nationalists would destroy the nation and the progressives would destroy progress. My last chapter in this book, it was the last thing I wrote, is about the American-led world order. And my end point is that no one else can defeat it, because all those engines of innovation and growth, authoritarians won't access it. They won't be able in the long run to challenge it. And there are too many countries who benefit from this open world order that they are willing to fight for it. So it won't be ruined from the outside. So the only thing that can defeat it is ourselves. That's why I agree with Abraham Lincoln when he declared that no transatlantic military giant could ever crush the American experiment. All the armies in the world with all the treasures of the world could not take by force a drink from the Ohio River. If ruin and defeat would ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. And that, I think, summarizes our choice. History shows that progress is not automatic, but neither is decline or fault. So that's my conclusion. And what makes me happy is that we've tried to commit suicide before, so we have much to learn from, of the mistakes of the past, but also inspiration from the past. We know what's at stake. The question is, what do? We have the advantage over all these eras. We can learn from their successes. We know what we should do. We know that we should try to rediscover that sense of life, that cultural sense of life, sense of wonder, and fight for this openness and liberty to rebuild the culture of optimism. And in that case, we can level up. We can go out there and we can build a golden age together and move on to the next stage. We still have time. Thank you.
Hi, it's Daniel from Iron Center, Ukraine. So I have two questions. One is really short and the other one's much longer. So the short one, do you believe that Golden Age should be only one in the history of civilization? Because, for example, in Bulgaria, where we are, they had some, several kingdoms, and they refer to each of them as a small Golden Ages they had in the past. And the second one is more broader one, because if you ask, for example, most of the Russians, and it was done for a long time, what is a golden age for them? it's not the time right now where the most richest in the whole history. It's not the time in the 90s when it was the most freest of the whole history. It's actually Stalin's era. Well, it was the most poorest country with a horrible standards of living, and they still rank the Stalin as a top one historical figure. For them, golden age is that. So my question is, golden age can be relative, as you mentioned on the start. How we make sure that is not a package deal where someone, for example, from a right says, well, the golden age clearly is a short Reich for us because it was the purest time in the past. Or someone on the left would say, of course, Cambodia or Vietnam, when they killed the half of the population, is the purest way of communism or something like that. Yeah. So the first question is only one golden age, or can we rebuild in the future? Yeah. And the second was how we make sure that, other ideologies will not steal the golden age from you as the author and from us as a movement.
Thank you. Two great questions. And the first answer is that there are tons of golden ages, semi-golden ages, and often localized in certain areas, just one sector or one particular art form or business or in certain places. And then it goes in cycles up and down, and there's nothing automatic. It's not just one chance we've got at this. We can do it all the time. We can build a golden age, and we can lose it as well. And that goes for most countries. When you look at it, they've had their ups and downs, definitely for sure. I wonder about Russia, though. I think Russia had a golden era. That was actually the old Novgorod Republic before the Muscovites destroyed it. That was an era where they had all of this. They had openness, they had rule of law, they had liberty, and they created an amazing place. But it was wrecked by outsiders, as so many other of these episodes. It's a very good point you've got. And I partly wrote this book to challenge that kind of nostalgic perspective, that we should go back to some pure good old days. Because I don't think there were any pure good old days, and certainly Stalin is not included in that. But people have that perception, especially if they've forgotten about the specifics. They remember the flags, they remember the monuments, they remember the power, the sense of fear it instilled in their neighbors and so on. It's so easy to think that something was a golden age based on it being a golden age for the despot and a couple of people around him. And that's why it's so important to look at it for real. What makes a real golden age? It's something that unleashes the opportunities, the creativity of more people in society. So to me, that's a way of challenging that kind of nostalgic narrative that's always used by would-be authoritarians in certain places. And the way to do it, I think, is to point out that what even made these eras, the good golden ages, relatively speaking, great, was not how they dressed, what they wore, who was in power, or anything like that. It's not like we can recreate that golden age by having Chinese dress up the way they looked during the Song dynasty. What made it great was that they didn't get stuck, that they thought that the future was brighter if they opened up for more opportunities and more freedoms. And that's clearly a lesson that Russia has got to learn again, I think.
First of all, thank you very much for this lecture. I really enjoyed that and I like that. And it all reminds me a lot of Nassim Nicholas Taleb's book, especially Black Swan and Anti-Fragile in terms of innovation, decentralization, and trying things. And also books of Deirdre McCloskey, especially Burgess' Dignity, and her statements align with what you have said today, but she actually mentioned that the biggest threat to our great development, to development of our world and how we became more complicated and richer, are totalitarian ideas such as fascism or ecologism that she called the new secular religion. So what is your point of view on these ideas that work like religions, that they have their gods, events, celebrations and so on? Is it really the danger for the reaching again the golden age. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for mentioning those sources of inspiration, especially Deirdre McCloskey's is a great source of inspiration to me. Her Bourgeois trilogy, I think, is necessary reading for everyone. Um, I agree with her. I think that specifically those ideologies that are almost like sort of secular religions are some of the greatest worries because they have one fixed utopia. They have one idea about what society should look like, how we all should live, and according to their plans. And this is really stasis. This is the opposite of any kind of idea of progress and any kind of idea that tomorrow might be a better place, because they've made it up to go along with, and that then denies all individual human agency. The very idea that great societies are built from surprises. When innovators and when entrepreneurs and when artists and come up with something completely unexpected, that's what creates decent, thriving, dynamic societies. And that's exactly why these kinds of secular religions that try to tell us all how to live our lives would deny.
Hello, thank you for the amazing talk. So, I also do comparative history. So, yes, I do think about Rome every day, and Athens and Sparta for the matter. Like, it is one of the most revered upon Dark Ages, like how horrible it is. You have to be a Spartan to be alive. But
Oh, yeah.
anyway, my question is on how do you think about whether an age like at this time, a certain country and at this time is in a golden age or a dark age, because one of the cases I would like to raise is Meiji Japan. So that is what I am studying. Well, that is what I spend most of my free time studying right now. And if you think about Japan's golden age, it has not started after the war. It has started like in Meiji Japan after the Meiji Restoration, because that is when they started. That is when they, one, opened the trade, so opened the entire country up, and two, built institutions and modeled upon successful institutions. And some of the less successful institutions, like the Imperial Japanese Army, not the Navy, just the Army.
Yeah.
But anyway, but then so if you think about that, like if there's no Meiji Japan, there wouldn't be post-war MacArthur Japan. So like it wouldn't have reformed so quickly if it didn't have the westernization before the war. But then if you think about it, it is very similar to like what China is right now. It is a dictatorship like Meiji Japan was, but also like it has technology, it has certain innovation, and well, some of them bogus. And then like it has and then it has some degree of free trade, which was also what Meiji Japan had, not like absolute free trade. So would you think like, would you think, for example, China is on the way up? Or is it really like, or does it take like another nuclear bomb for China to be on the way up? Rather grim question.
That's another loaded question. But thank you. That was incredibly interesting. And first of all, I'm happy that you think about Rome every day. I'll share this little secret with you all. When I looked into that meme, who started this, who says that we all think about Rome every day, I got in touch with him. He was a Roman reenactor calling himself Gavius Flavius, who walks around on Instagram with ancient Roman uniforms. It turned out that I knew him. He had actually organized a lecture with me a couple of years ago, so we talked a lot about this, and he had interesting insights. He just loves everything Rome. He has no selective admiration, and that's obviously something that one should have. For example, when it comes to Japan and the Meiji Restoration, it was actually on my shortlist of golden eras because it was a spectacular era of creativity, I must say, and the way in which it hyper modernized overnight is just stunning. Unfortunately, it imitated some bad European ideas as well along the way. So, okay, it's not just all these technologies and science and stuff, but also let's build a European empire over here as well. So it's complicated, but it's often complicated. But your real question is about China. I'd say this. Lots of people, when I started to talk about this book, people always ask me, so is China the eighth civilization? Is that where we're going? In a way, it should be. I mean, 1.4 billion people with the kind of history they've got, they should be able to do this. But I'm not sure that's going to happen because of the authoritarian backlash in China right now. There is innovation in certain places, but it comes from unexpected places. It's still the case whenever the government centralizes and directs and commands, it ends up building rust belt industries in China or just excess capacity, destroying capital. And then we get things like DeepSeek, which is amazing, partly probably built on American models, but still impressive. But the thing is, that did not come from a state university or from state venture capital or from a state business in China. It came from a quant hedge fund in China, one of those businesses that Xi Jinping hates and wants to destroy. They're a legacy from a previous era of liberalization in China. So when they talked about AI, they didn't expect that sort of quant hedge funds would come up with it. They expected the decent universities and state businesses would do it. And that tells you two things. First of all, it tells you that it's still sufficiently open to come up with some amazing innovations and surprises. So it's not all over, but it also tells you that this is not the Chinese model right now. This might change in the future. We have no idea. But right now, what she is trying to do is direct resources to and picking industries and picking winners. And that, I don't think that's the future of it all. I think that's a way of ruining entrepreneurship and destroying capital. This is a way, and that's what we've seen. They've got a mountain of debt because they bailed everything out after the previous financial crisis, and they just keep doing it, throwing money at everything. Yes, we see it in terms of lots of stuff coming our way, but it's not a clever way of using your own resources in subsidizing Western consumption. I mean, we Chinese taxpayers and Chinese borrowers should complain about this. I don't think they have that engine of innovation because they are too centralized, they're too authoritarian, it's too much of the emperor's way or the highway. And until that changes, I don't believe in, I'm not a China bull.
Now you've talked a lot about people forgetting either the worst part or other parts of the golden age and all these things. And it actually brought me back to another Roman thing to think, where there's an old poem from England where they describe all the decaying buildings from the Roman age as the work of giants decaying, where they've forgotten who built it.
Yeah.
And all these forgetting as well. But do you think also this is with ideas, people forgetting ideas, forgetting optimism? And how do you get back to rediscovering these things you forget? Do you have to rediscover the bad things? You have to rediscover the good things. You might also have to rediscover optimism. Is this possible, and how?
Oh, that's a great question. And historically we lost ideas because they were written on papyrus and they were ruined by the weather and insects, and lost it in the ground, and those ideas were gone forever. What's our excuse? Because all the ideas are out there. We should be able to do better than we do. But the way in which we forget is brutally highlighted in recent American policy making. I mean, I've been involved in trade policy for some 30 years. And what everybody knew, even people who hadn't ever come close to economics, is that, look, America did the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in 1930, and it ruined the US economy, and it ruined European economies, and it created massive unemployment, and all democracies collapsed. Let's not do that again. How hard can it be? Now we're in a world where the American president has implemented even higher tariffs than the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. And it seems like lots of people around the world would want something similar back home. So yes, we forget ideas. We forget what they're about. We forget their real life implications. The moment, if not the moment the crisis is over, at least when those are dead who experienced it. Because it's so difficult to see that abstract ideas have real flesh and blood consequences. And that's unfortunately, I think, a reason why we repeat the same kind of mistakes over and over again once some time has passed. You know, why is Sweden so much better when it comes to public debt than all other countries almost? Sweden really is. We have public debt at 30% compared to 100 in the United States. Well, that's because we had a ruinous financial crisis in the early 1990s, and it almost destroyed the Swedish economy. We had mass unemployment, things were falling apart. And people who are in politics right now, they remember that this is not just numbers, this is the real deal. But once that generation has passed, I'm sure we'll make the same mistakes again. So we do forget things, and definitely when it comes to broader themes like optimism and hope, because that's even more abstract to lots of people. And so it's like, it's the old saying of he who does not know his history is doomed to repeat it. This is also, even if you do read your history, you're doomed to seeing everybody else repeat it. And you're standing there yelling, "What are you doing?" But we can influence those things. That's my hope. That's why I do what I'm doing, and I'm sure you're doing what you're doing. We can remind people that it has flesh and blood consequences, that ideas matter. Everybody won't listen. It won't make the entire difference every single time. But if we can at least moderate the worst trends and show that something else is possible, we're breaking small holes in that wall, and that might be enough to make us avoid the worst of consequences, at least. And if that happens, that's something.